In a crowded country auction barn, an old, thin mare stood trembling in a pen marked for slaughter. The crowd called her useless, broken, trash. But one quiet veteran in the back of the room noticed a small, faded brand on her shoulder, and his heart stopped. Many years ago, this very horse carried his best friend through a nightmare of war and saved more lives than anyone will ever know. Now, forgotten by the world she once served, she was being sold for meat. This is a story about loyalty, memory, and the debts we carry long after the battlefield goes quiet. Hit like and subscribe before we begin, because this one will stay with you. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Jerry hadn't planned on going to the auction that Saturday. He was 63 years old and had been retired from the military for 15 years. He lived alone on 40 acres in the Kentucky hills, a place quiet enough that he could hear himself think, and far enough from town that he didn't have to explain why he sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't go back to sleep. He raised a few cattle. He kept a vegetable garden. He fixed things that broke. And he tried very hard not to think about the war. But his neighbor had asked him for a favor. Drive into town, attend the livestock auction, bid on a good workhorse if one came up cheap. The neighbor's back was out, and he couldn't make the trip himself. Jerry said yes because it gave him something to do on a Saturday, and because saying no required more conversation than saying yes. The auction barn was packed when Jerry arrived. Farmers and ranchers filled the bleachers, their voices loud and rough, the air thick with the smell of animals and hay and tobacco. Jerry found a spot in the back row where he could see the ring and settled in to wait. The auction moved fast. Cattle first, then goats, then a few younger horses that went for decent money to people who knew what they were looking at. Jerry watched without much interest, marking down prices in a small notebook, waiting for something that matched what his neighbor wanted. Then Lot 47 entered the ring, an old mare, led in by a handler who was clearly annoyed at having to deal with her. She was thin, her ribs visible even from the back row. Her coat was dull and patchy. Her head hung low. She moved slowly, each step looking like it cost her more energy than she had to give. The auctioneer, a man named Chad with a voice like gravel and a permanent smirk, started his pitch. He called her a reject, a meat horse, good for nothing but dog food and glue. The crowd laughed. Someone in the front row called her trash. Someone else said she wasn't worth hauling to the slaughterhouse. Chad kept talking, his voice dripping with contempt, trying to get any bid at all just to move her along. Jerry was about to look away when the mare turned slightly in the ring, and he saw the brand on her left shoulder. It was small, faded almost to nothing, a marking most people wouldn't notice or wouldn't recognize. But Jerry recognized it immediately because he had seen it every day for 8 months in a place so far from Kentucky it might as well have been another planet. A cavalry unit brand, specific to a mounted reconnaissance platoon that had operated in a war most people didn't talk about anymore because it had ended badly and the government preferred to pretend it had never happened. Jerry's platoon. His hand tightened on the notebook. His heart was suddenly loud in his ears. He stared at the mare, at the brand, at the way she held her head, and his mind started pulling up memories he had spent 15 years trying to bury. The war had been brutal. A border conflict in a country whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce, fought over resources and territory and old grudges that had nothing to do with the soldiers sent to die there. Jerry's unit had been deployed to the mountains, tasked with reconnaissance and patrol in terrain so rough that vehicles were useless. So they used horses, cavalry, old-fashioned, almost absurd in a modern war, but effective. The horses could go where trucks couldn't. They were quieter than engines. They didn't need fuel. And in those mountains, they saved lives. Jerry had ridden a horse named Athena, and his best friend Paul had ridden a mare they called Valor. Paul had loved that horse, talked to her constantly, brushed her every night even when he was exhausted, trusted her completely in situations where trust was the only thing keeping you alive. Valor had been steady, calm under fire, smart enough to sense danger before the soldiers did. She had carried Paul through ambushes and firefights and forced marches through hostile territory. She had never panicked, never quit. And then, on a mission 8 months into their deployment, everything went wrong. They had been moving through a narrow canyon when the ambush hit. Gunfire from both sides. Grenades. Chaos. Jerry's horse went down in the first volley, and Jerry hit the ground hard, his legs shattered, unable to move. Paul had turned Valor around, rode straight back into the kill zone, pulled Jerry up behind him while bullets tore through the air around them. Valor carried them both out of that canyon, carrying double weight, moving fast even though she was hit, bleeding from her shoulder and her flank, refusing to stop until they reached cover. Paul had been hit too, worse than the horse. He didn't make it to the medevac point. Jerry survived because Paul and Valor had gone back for him. And now, 15 years later, Jerry was sitting in an auction barn watching Valor being sold for meat while a crowd of strangers called her trash. Jerry stood up, his voice cut through the noise of the auction barn, louder than he had spoken in years. He called out a bid, high enough to make Chad stop mid-sentence, high enough that the crowd turned to look. Chad recovered quickly, his smirk returning, clearly thinking some fool had just decided to overpay for a meat horse. He called for higher bids. No one responded. The crowd had already moved on, already forgotten the old mare in the ring. Chad called it, sold to the man in the back. Jerry walked down to the payment office and emptied his bank account. Every dollar he had saved for vehicle repairs and property taxes and 100 small emergencies that came with living alone on 40 acres. He paid in cash, signed the paperwork, and walked out to the holding pens where Valor was waiting. She was standing in the corner of a small pen, her head still low, her body trembling slightly. She didn't look up when Jerry approached. She had learned, probably long ago, that people meant pain or indifference, and it was safer not to hope for anything else. Jerry opened the gate slowly and stepped inside. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, giving her time, giving her space. And then he spoke. He said her name, the name Paul had given her. The name Jerry hadn't said out loud in 15 years. Valor. The mare's head came up. Slowly, her ears swiveled toward the sound. And for just a moment, something flickered in her dark eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just confusion that someone had used a name she hadn't heard in a very long time. Jerry stepped closer. He reached out his hand and let her smell it. Then he placed his palm gently on her neck, right below the faded brand on her shoulder. He told her he was sorry. He told her he should have come looking for her years ago. He told her she was going home. Getting Valor into the trailer was difficult. She was weak and scared and had no reason to trust that this was anything other than another bad thing happening to her. But Jerry was patient. He moved slowly. He talked to her constantly in the same low, steady voice Paul had used. And eventually, Valor stepped into the trailer. Jerry drove her home through the Kentucky hills as the sun set behind the mountains. He pulled into his property just as darkness fell and led Valor carefully out of the trailer and into the barn. He had prepared a stall with fresh hay and clean water. He had set out grain and supplements. He had called a veterinarian and scheduled an emergency visit for first thing in the morning. Valor stood in the stall and looked around. Jerry could see her processing it. The clean bedding, the food, the quiet. She didn't trust it yet, but she was too tired to fight it. Jerry sat on an overturned bucket outside the stall and watched her through the night. He didn't sleep. He just sat there, keeping vigil, the way Paul would have wanted him to. The veterinarian arrived at dawn. A woman named Sarah who had worked with rescue horses before and knew what severe neglect looked like. She examined Valor thoroughly and gave Jerry the assessment he had been expecting. Valor was severely underweight. She had untreated injuries that had healed badly. She had infections in her hooves from standing in filth for too long. She was maybe a year away from complete system failure. But she could be saved. If Jerry was willing to put in the time and the money and the effort, Valor could recover. Jerry told Sarah to do whatever it took. The first month was the hardest. Valor was so weak she could barely stand for long periods. Jerry fed her small amounts every few hours, carefully reintroducing nutrition to a system that had been starving. He cleaned her wounds and treated her infections and stood with her when she was too tired to stand on her own. He talked to her constantly about Paul, about the war, about the day she had carried them both out of that canyon, about how much Paul had loved her, about how sorry Jerry was that it had taken him this long to find her. Valor listened. Jerry didn't know how much she understood, but she seemed to recognize his voice. And slowly, over weeks and then months, she started to trust him. By the second month, Valor was gaining weight. Her coat was starting to shine. The infections had cleared. She was moving more freely, spending time in the pasture, grazing in the sun. By the third month, she was following Jerry around like a dog. She would nicker when she heard his truck coming up the driveway. She would rest her head on his shoulder when he stood at the fence. She remembered what it felt like to be cared for. Jerry found himself talking to Valor about things he had never told anyone, about the guilt he carried, about Paul, about the war that had ended 15 years ago, but that Jerry had never really left behind. Valor stood quietly and listened, and somehow, having her there made the weight a little lighter. One evening, about 4 months after bringing Valor home, Jerry was sitting on his porch watching her graze in the pasture when his neighbor stopped by. The same neighbor who had asked Jerry to go to the auction in the first place. The neighbor looked at Valor, then at Jerry, and asked if that was the horse he had bought. Jerry said yes. The neighbor said she looked good, said Jerry must have done a hell of a job bringing her back from whatever state she had been in. Jerry was quiet for a moment. Then he told his neighbor the story. About the war, about Paul, about the canyon, about how Valor had saved his life and he had spent 15 years trying not to think about what happened to her after. The neighbor listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Jerry finished, the neighbor was quiet for a long time. Then he said that sometimes the debts we owe don't have expiration dates, and sometimes paying them back is the only way to move forward. Jerry thought about that. He looked at Valor, standing peacefully in the pasture, her coat gleaming in the evening light, her body strong and healthy again. He thought about Paul, about the promise he had never made out loud, but had carried anyway, to take care of Valor if he ever got the chance, to make sure she was safe. It had taken 15 years, but he had kept it. Valor would live out the rest of her life on Jerry's 40 acres. She would never be ridden again. She didn't need to be. She had served enough, given enough, survived enough. Now she could just be a horse, safe and cared for and remembered. Jerry would make sure of it, because that's what you did for the ones who carried you home. Jerry didn't go to that auction looking for Valor, but when he saw her, he couldn't walk away. Some debts run deeper than money. Some promises don't need words. And some acts of loyalty echo across decades, waiting for the moment when they can finally be honored. If this story moved you, share it with someone who understands what it means to carry the weight of those we've lost. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And drop a comment below. Do you believe some debts are worth everything to repay?